Rick Sanchez is designed to make sympathy feel naive. The drinking, the genius, the armor of contempt he wears into every room. Most of the time it works. Then the show keeps pulling the armor back, one episode at a time, until the man underneath it is impossible to ignore. In this video, we break down every Rick Sanchez paradox, the catchphrase paradox. In the early years of Rick and Morty's cultural rise, a phrase attached itself to the show the way phrases sometimes do. Not because anyone planned it, but because something in the sound of it matched a feeling the audience already had. It landed on t-shirts sold at conventions, on phone cases, in the comments of every related video on the internet. People shouted it at each other across parking lots in the recognition shorthand of shared fandom, the 2-second signal that says, "I watch this show, I am in on the joke." Google's search engine briefly ran it as an Easter egg, arranged so that typing the phrase into the search bar returned the question, "Did you mean, I am in great pain, please help me?" The merch kept selling. The Easter egg mostly went unnoticed. The phrase was "Wubba Lubba Dub Dub," and by the time the audience had finished treating it as a logo, they had already spent 2 years laughing at it, without quite registering that the show had explained it plainly, in the 11th episode of the first season, by the one character most qualified to translate it. Birdperson takes Morty aside at a party in that episode and says what the phrase translates to in the language of his people. The delivery is flat, no comedy inflection, no reaction shot designed to tell the audience how to feel. In Birdperson's tongue, the thing Rick shouts at every triumph and every exit and every successful gag means, "I am in great pain, please help me." Morty pushes back, saying, Rick says it ironically. The scene lasts under a minute. The party keeps going around it, the show moves on to the next set piece, and the information has been delivered and left entirely up to the viewer. This is the paradox in its smallest and most durable form. A disclosure of the man's interior, offered inside a scene that refuses to treat itself as a disclosure, trusting the audience to hold it or file it as background noise, playing either response as correct. Revealing something true about Rick inside a moment the show refuses to mark as significant becomes one of the defining methods of the whole series. The disclosure is real, and the comedy surrounding it does not cancel it out. The comedy simply ensures that anyone who does not want to sit with the information has immediate permission to laugh and move on. Rick is the only character whose interior is handled this way, where his most exposed moments arrive embedded in material that makes them easy to dismiss, because that is precisely how he presents himself to the people around him, and the show refuses to grant the audience a viewing angle on him that he would not sanction in the room. The catchphrase moment is the earliest and clearest use of that method, and it sets the expectation for everything that follows. The show will lay the man bare and then hand everyone a joke to hold while they decide whether to look. The phrase was not designed to carry any of this weight. Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland were doing something narrow and satirical when they gave Rick a catchphrase in the 5th episode of the first season. Both creators described the intent as a direct mockery of the beloved catchphrase phenomenon in popular television, specifically the kind of ritual crowd participation that late-night talk shows had turned into a performance contract between hosts and audiences. Rick even names his inspiration out loud when he first introduces the phrase, attributing the format to Arsenio Hall, the comedian whose audience whoop was one of the more famous examples of the genre. The joke was that a man who claims to despise mass cultural performance was manufacturing himself a catchphrase and deploying it on cue, the hypocrisy visible and self-aware and played for exactly the hollow recognition the format produces. What emerged instead was a genuine catchphrase that spread faster and stuck harder than most sincerely intended ones, until the phrase was indistinguishable from the character. The mockery became the thing it mocked. The performance of performing became the performance. Escaping its satirical frame came down to something the audience does naturally with Rick Sanchez, which is to receive his deflections as the authentic version of him rather than as deflections. He does something as a shield, a distancing gesture, a way of performing a simpler version of himself than the one actually present, and the audience embraces the shield as the man. The shrug he uses to keep people at arm's length becomes the trait his audience loves him for. The nihilism deployed to avoid sitting with grief becomes the philosophy people put on their walls. The catchphrase invented to mock the kind of person who needs a catchphrase became the thing people repeat when they want to signal that they understand him. Every expression of his interior that Rick allows to escape into public view arrives in a form that protects him from the reception he fears most, which is anyone taking it seriously enough to push through it. The audience who bought the t-shirt did exactly what his family does every day, received the front of him and experienced it as the whole. 6 episodes before Bird Person names the translation, the show has already been building the evidence for it without drawing attention to the process. Rick returns from chaotic adventures and reaches for a drink rather than a conversation. He constructs exits from every room before he has fully entered it. He answers the moments where something could land emotionally with a shrug or a gag, so practiced that the transition from feeling to performance takes less than a breath. None of this is flagged as significant in season 1 because the show presents it as personality, which is accurate, and as management, which is also accurate, and lets the viewer decide how much of each they are watching. By the time Bird Person makes the translation available, the audience has seen enough of the pattern to recognize the phrase as a compressed version of it, even if they could not have articulated the connection before he named it. What makes Bird Person the right voice for the disclosure is his position in Rick's history. He is Rick's oldest surviving close friend, a figure whose relationship to him reaches back before the armor was fully constructed, to the years of the Galactic Resistance, when Rick was someone who fought for causes larger than himself. He knew Rick when the pain was new enough that it may not have needed to be hidden yet, or when the hiding had not yet become so instinctive that Rick could no longer feel the difference between the performance and the man underneath it. When Bird Person tells Morty what the phrase means, he is not analyzing a character. He is reporting on a person he has known for a very long time. The casualness of the delivery, the assumption that this is simply known information rather than a revelation, implies that to anyone who was near Rick before the performance was fully constructed, the translation has never been ambiguous. The decoding is not linguistic. The translation is just the formal version of what the people who knew him earliest have always been able to hear directly, which is why it takes a party full of strangers before Bird Person says it out loud. The strangers are the only ones for whom it would be news. A clear division runs through the show's portrait of Rick from this disclosure forward. People who encounter him now, the family he arrived into as a returned stranger, need an interpreter. The people who knew him before do not. Bird Person, and through him the audience, understands that what the family reads as Rick's personality is what an older friend reads as symptom, and that the symptom has been present long enough that the person living with it has stopped distinguishing it from personality. The catchphrase is the artifact that makes this visible most cleanly, the public flag of a produced version of a man who used to be different, flying in rooms where almost nobody knows what the flag says. Humor functions across the whole run as Rick's primary defensive structure, and the phrase is where the show first introduces that pattern in compressed form. Every joke he lands is a joke he does not have to answer for. Every time a room laughs, that room converts from a place where someone might reach him into a place where everyone is performing alongside him, and that conversion is the safest feeling available to him in a social situation. He walks into moments that carry genuine emotional weight and begins making them funny, and by the time everyone is laughing, the subject has already shifted from whatever was present to the joke, and the transition is smooth enough to read as personality rather than management. The catchphrase is the compressed version of this skill, a sound that can change the temperature of a room before anyone has had time to look at what was there before it arrived. Morty's response of "it is irony" is the most interesting element of the scene, because the show never definitively refutes it. A man smart enough to run nested schemes in his sleep is smart enough to select a catchphrase that functions as a covert message to the one person who can read it, knowing that everyone else hears it as noise. On that reading, every time he shouts the phrase in a packed room, he is communicating his actual state through a channel that requires specialized knowledge to decode, keeping the truth in plain sight while ensuring the people who receive it do not recognize what they are receiving. Bird Person understands it. The family does not. The catchphrase becomes, on this reading, Rick's most consistent, ongoing act of honesty, delivered daily to an audience that files it as a punchline. Long grief does something specific to expression, and the alternative reading of the phrase accounts for this. It embeds itself into the daily patterns of language, into the shrugs and the jokes and the drinking and the boredom, until the person making the noises stops being able to distinguish with certainty which are deliberate signals and which have simply become the texture of moving through a day. The phrase may have stopped being a cipher at some point and become his native tongue, the sound of someone who has been in pain long enough that announcing the pain is simply how they speak. Morty's ironic reading and Bird Person's sincere reading are both accurate for the same underlying reason. The show has built a man for whom the sincere and the ironic have, over a very long time, collapsed into each other until neither one can be cleanly separated from its twin. Autoerotic assimilation, the third episode of the second season is where the phrase stops being an interesting layer and becomes the explicit subject of the episode's emotional logic. Rick spends most of it reuniting with Unity, a hive mind capable of occupying and directing entire populations. And the relationship they rekindle has the quality of two people who are genuinely bad for each other and uniquely suited to each other at the same time. Unity eventually leaves because being near Rick pulls her out of herself in ways she cannot sustain. The letters she leaves describe the dynamic with precision. Being near him makes her better at what she does and worse at what she is. She identifies his pull as stronger than hers, which is the episode's most telling detail. An entity that can assimilate entire planets recognizes Rick Sanchez as the more powerful absorption force and retreats from the best relationship she has ever had because the relationship is quietly destroying her. A hive mind that controls everything encounters the one thing it cannot assimilate. What the show stages in the garage at the end of that episode is not a dramatic breakdown. The sequence is quiet and handled with deliberate restraint. Rick tends to a creature in obvious distress, comforts it, and then prepares the same device for himself. He passes out before it finishes preparing. The show holds on him in the morning light, slumped at his workbench, and then cuts away without comment or explanation. The music chosen for the sequence is a song by the band Chaos called Do You Feel It? And the question it keeps asking is a plain language version of the catchphrase, rephrased without the noise. The episode received a perfect approval score from critics at the time of its release. The merchandise carrying the phrase had been on sale for months. The show placed the disclosure in the garage, and the audience wore the t-shirts, and both things kept running alongside each other without either one canceling the other out. Across the full run, the phrase appears with decreasing frequency as Rick's public performance becomes more sophisticated, but the structure it introduced never changes. Every victory he shouts, and every scheme he completes, and every room he fills with laughter is running the same dual channel at once. A performance of triumph alongside a statement of distress, each real, each unresolvable into the other. The Google Easter egg that converted the search phrase into a question about pain was not an editorial comment inserted from outside the show. It was the phrase functioning exactly as it functions inside the show, as something that can be received as a joke and also as the most direct statement the man ever makes about his interior state, depending entirely on which frequency the person doing the listening is tuned to. Rick's first paradox establishes the grammar that every subsequent one operates in. He does not express his interior life in plain declarative sentences. He does not say he is in grief or afraid of what lives outside the walls he built, or that the loss which organized his life into a decades-long mission is still sitting in him exactly where it was when it arrived. He shouts a nonsense phrase in a room full of people, and one of them knows what it means, and the rest are laughing, and the show keeps all three things running simultaneously without apologizing for the difficulty of holding them all at once. The audience got the phrase on a t-shirt. Bird Person got the translation. Both of them received the same transmission in the same moment, and only one of them understood that receiving it was the whole point. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The catchphrase paradox showed the loudest thing about Rick Sanchez quietly broadcasting his deepest pain, a disclosure the audience turned into merchandise. Next, the second paradox examines the portal gun, the most recognized symbol of infinite freedom in the show, and the specific way a man who can go anywhere used that freedom to build the most controlled existence imaginable. Section 2, the freedom paradox. A green rectangle of light appears in the air. A doorway opens inside it, and through the doorway is somewhere entirely different from the room the doorway appeared in. That is all the portal gun does. The object fits in a jacket pocket. The fluid inside it glows, and in the hands of Rick Sanchez, it makes every wall in existence optional. Any border, any dimension, any reality he can name or imagine becomes permeable the instant he reaches for his hip. When the show introduced this device in its first episode and kept it there for every episode that followed, it was staging an image of freedom so total that the concept stops being useful as a description. Freedom means the possibility of going somewhere. The portal gun converts the question of whether to go somewhere into the only question that was ever available, and the answer has always been yes. The show spent seasons letting that image work undisturbed. Rick uses the gun casually, clips it to his side like a habit, and the casualness is the statement. A being with a portal gun does not plan a route. A being with a portal gun does not worry about whether the door will be locked when it gets there. Consequences from one reality become optional because another reality is always one trigger pull away, and the series mines that optionality for both comedy and horror across its entire run. In Rick Potion number 9 from the first season, the horror version arrives in its cleanest form. After the serum Rick brewed for Morty converts the population of their home Earth into a species of grotesque hybrid creatures and then then mutates them further into something worse, the expected move for any character in any other show would be to find the cure, face the damage, make it right. Rick cannot find the cure. He tries and fails, which is its own small revelation about the limits of even his raw scientific tier. And his answer to that failure is to pull out the gun and locate a reality where alternate versions of himself and Morty died in a lab accident, so the two of them can slide into those dead versions' places and let the destroyed Earth continue without them. He leaves. He takes Morty with him. The ruined world keeps running. The portal gun made this possible, and the portal gun is freedom. And so freedom, in this moment, means Morty digging a grave in the backyard of a borrowed house and looking at his own dead face while the shovel goes in. That episode is the one the show returns to most often as the bedrock of what the series actually is. The home the audience has spent every episode in since is not the original. It is a second-hand reality the pair moved into after Rick destroyed the first one. And the family at the center of the story is not technically the family either of them belong to by origin. The wife, the sister, the father, all of them are the native inhabitants of a dimension that had its own Rick and its own Morty until those versions died in a lab accident. And now they have replacements, wearing the same faces, carrying the same names, sleeping in the dead versions' beds and using their things and pretending. Freedom made this happen. The portal gun made this possible. The show refuses to let the audience forget it, returning to that backyard grave in later seasons, treating the buried corpses as the permanent secret under every scene set in that house. Freedom costs something even when the person exercising it pays no attention to the bill. And the bill in this case is paid in full by a 14-year-old burying himself in someone else's garden. The clearest explanation of how Rick actually uses his freedom arrives in the 5th season finale, and it is delivered by the character least interested in flattering him. Evil Morty, standing at the machinery he built to open the structure the Rick spent an untold period constructing, describes the central finite curve for the audience in terms that reframe the entire premise of the show up to that point. The Ricks, across all their variants, use their portal technology to wall off a portion of the multiverse, selecting only those realities where a Rick is the smartest being present and excluding every reality where that condition is not met. The result is what the audience has always understood as the multiverse, the vast space Rick navigates with his gun, and it is not the multiverse. It is a curated pocket. It is a selection. It is freedom of movement inside a structure the Ricks built to ensure they never encountered anything larger than themselves. Every portal Rick opened across the full run of the series opened onto a reality pre-screened for his supremacy. The gun that can go anywhere only ever went to places the Ricks had already approved. Evil Morty names this with the contempt it deserves, calling it an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. The baby is Rick. The crib is the structure every version of him helped construct to ensure the most powerful mind in any room he entered was always the same mind, always his own, the one he could trust because he had been living inside it his whole life. The portal gun, the object the show presents as the purest expression of his genius and the most complete form of freedom available to any being in fiction, turns out to be a key that only fits locks the Ricks installed themselves. What looked like the ability to go anywhere was, from the beginning, the ability to go anywhere inside the prison they collectively agreed to inhabit. And the prison was designed specifically so that it would not feel like one. No wall feels like a wall when it is built at the edge of everything you have ever known, and the outside has never been visible from where you stand. Freedom, in his hands, turns out to be a performance of freedom, executed with such technical competence that neither Rick nor the audience questions whether the thing being performed matches the thing it claims to be. He portals into impossible situations and portals out of them, and the entrances and exits are both so confident and so habitual that the watching mind files them as evidence of limitlessness. What the series eventually reveals is that the exits were always going somewhere on a pre-approved list, and the entrances were always staged for an audience that could not read the structure surrounding the stage. The man who can go anywhere has only ever been going to places that guaranteed him something, and what they guaranteed was never adventure or discovery, but a specific result, the preservation of his position at the top of whatever room he walked into. When the action briefly crosses outside the curve in the 7th season episode Unmortrican, the show allows a glimpse of what actual freedom looks like, and it is not what the portal gun promised. Out in the true infinite, the landscape is wrecked and vast, and populated by beings who arrived at portal travel without anyone's help, who have no particular particular knowledge of what a Rick is, and no reason to care. It is chaotic and dangerous, and from the perspective of any being who spent a lifetime inside the crib, overwhelming in a way the Curve never was. Evil Morty has carved himself a quiet space inside that chaos, and named it Paradise, precisely because no version of Rick rules it. The freedom available outside the Curve is not the clean, confident, tool-in-pocket freedom the show depicted for seasons. It requires a different kind of courage, the kind that comes from having no guaranteed outcome and no pre-screened room to walk into. The kind the portal gun aimed inward at the Curve never had to develop because the Curve existed specifically to make it unnecessary. What the portal gun actually produces, episode by episode across the full run, is not freedom, but avoidance at scale. Rick does not stay anywhere long enough to face consequences. When a planet is ruined, he leaves. When a relationship becomes uncomfortable, he portals out before the conversation can finish landing. When his garage becomes the site of the worst night of his life after Unity departs, he passes out rather than walking away, which is the one episode where the departure mechanism fails him and forces him to wake up in the place where the feeling happened. Every other episode, the gun provides an exit before the feeling can finish arriving. He reaches for it the way he reaches for a drink, not because he wants to go somewhere, but because he cannot stand to remain where he is. And the show makes the connection legible early enough that the audience can feel it before they can name it. The portal gun and the flask are the same object performing the same function through different materials. The suburban house is the most revealing counterpoint to everything the gun promises, and the show uses the contrast deliberately across all its seasons. Rick Sanchez has access to every reality inside a carefully curated infinity, and he lives in a house in a suburb, in a garage attached to that house, with a stool and a workbench and a flask he keeps within reach. He returns there from across the multiverse again and again, regardless of what else is happening or where he has been. Other characters leave and return from normal distances, from work or school or a difficult evening. Rick leaves and returns from dimensions that do not share the same physics, from planets built on entirely different rules, from encounters with civilizations that have been running longer than this star system has been warm. He comes back to the same garage every time. He sits on the same stool. The portal gun gives him infinite departure points, and he always departs from the same place and arrives back at it. And the show frames this repetition without sentimentality, letting the pattern speak without underscoring it. A being of infinite freedom has a regular chair and a regular household and a set of people he keeps returning to despite everything his nihilism insists about their replaceability. The house is where Beth is, and where Morty is, and where Summer is, and the gun does not change that, because the gun only affects direction of travel and has no mechanism for addressing the underlying reason for traveling. He is free to go anywhere, and he keeps going back to the garage, and the distance between those two facts is where the paradox lives most quietly. The character the show presents as the most mobile being in any story returns, episode after episode, the least exotic location available to him, and sits on a stool in it, and the show asks the audience to notice the pattern without quite naming what the pattern says about him. He can leave any situation, and he keeps arriving back at the same one. The gun is real, and the freedom is real, and the garage is also real, and the three of them together constitute a portrait of a man whose freedom of movement has never translated into freedom from the thing he most needs to escape, which is the interior state the departure is designed to manage. His freedom also circulates through the household as a kind of low-level threat that nobody names, but everyone feels. The freedom to leave a ruined reality means that Morty carries the knowledge of a grave in the backyard without being able to tell anyone who would understand it. The freedom to portal out of an uncomfortable truth means that Beth spends her whole adult life in the specific uncertainty Rick could have resolved and chose not to, because resolving it would require him to stay in the room while she processed whatever the truth turned out to be. The freedom to build decoy families and consciousness transfers and contingency clone bodies means that everyone near him is always potentially a version rather than the original, always potentially the replaceable one. His freedom is never only his. It passes through the people nearest him as a permanent ambient instability, the knowledge that he could leave at any moment, that the exit requires nothing from him and everything from whoever he leaves behind. Operation Phoenix, the consciousness transfer contingency the show reveals in the 4th season premiere, extends the portal gun's logic into death itself. When Rick dies in any dimension, the system uploads his mind to a waiting clone body, and he wakes up somewhere else, essentially alive again. The continuity of the self preserved across what should have have been an ending. The portal gun opened doors between dimensions. Operation Phoenix opens a door between death and continued existence, and the two systems serve the same master purpose. Both ensure that no situation he enters can hold him past the point where he wants to leave. Death becomes a door the same way a Federation prison became a door, and the same way a ruined Earth became a door, and the same way a difficult conversation in the garage becomes a door. The freedom to leave extends, in his case, all the way past the last available exit, and the show treats this not as triumph, but as the logical conclusion of a pattern that was always going to end somewhere like this. The central finite curve is the paradox at its largest scale. The greatest exercise of freedom in the show's history, the construction of a navigable multiverse spanning infinite realities, was simultaneously the greatest act of self-restriction in the show's history, a collective decision to trade true infinity for a managed and pre-screened space. The Ricks built with their freedom a wall around their freedom, and then went on living inside the wall as if the wall were the horizon, which is precisely what walls do when they are built well enough and far enough out that the structure stops being visible. Rick walks through that managed space with a gun on his hip and calls it infinite, and the show eventually reveals that the word means something smaller than anyone assumed, which is the paradox's final turn. A man whose defining trait is the freedom to go anywhere spent the full run of the series going only to places he already controlled, and calling the pattern liberation, and the audience called it liberation alongside him because the gun looked so convincing, and the exits were always so clean, and nobody could see the wall from inside the place the wall was built to protect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Freedom Paradox showed a portal gun pointed at infinity, used to build a smaller and safer world where nothing unpredictable could reach him. Next, the focus turns to the third paradox, the man who spent a lifetime dismantling every authority that tried to claim him, and yet ran his own household like the most controlling institution he ever opposed. Section 3. The Control Paradox. Most of the people Rick Sanchez has ever encountered in a position of power have, at some point, ended up removed from it. The Galactic Federation, an interplanetary government with the resources and jurisdiction to build a prison specifically designed to hold the smartest man alive, lost its economy in a single afternoon when the smartest man alive quietly reclassified the value of its currency to zero and walked out wearing a stolen face. The Council of Ricks, an interdimensional governing body composed entirely of versions of Rick himself, was dismantled in the same episode that staged its tribunal, taken apart by the very man it assembled to try. The President of the United States, the most consequential political figure on a planet Rick visits with the casualness of someone stopping at a gas station, spent multiple episodes being driven into a sputtering personal rivalry by someone who treats the office as a minor obstacle between himself and wherever he is trying to be. Governments, federations, councils, bureaucracies, and institutions of every scale have encountered Rick Sanchez and ended up either collapsed or irrelevant. The record across the full run of the show is consistent enough to read as principle. Rick Sanchez does not submit to authority. An authority that presses the point tends to stop existing. The show builds this reputation carefully and lets it harden into one of the character's most reliable features. His anti-authoritarian stance is not casual cynicism in the mode of someone who simply dislikes being told what to do. It is active, structured, and operating at all times as a background program running underneath whatever else he is engaged with. He describes himself, across several episodes, as being constitutionally opposed to institutions that claim the right to govern him, and the show consistently validates this through plot outcomes rather than just through his own self-assessment. When he says he cannot be held, the show demonstrates it. When he says governments are a collective fiction sustained by the consent of people who do not know any better, the show puts him in front of a galactic superpower and has him dissolve it before lunch. The anti-authority credential is not aspirational. It is a running tab of verified claims. His relationship with the Council of Ricks sharpens this portrait, because the Council is the hardest case. It is not a foreign institution with alien values and no claim on him. It is a government of himself, a body made entirely of his own variants, and the Council treats his refusal to join as its central grievance against him, marking him as the malcontent of all the Ricks in the central finite curve, because he will not take a seat at a table made of his own faces. The Season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind uses this refusal as the backstory for everything that follows in the episode, establishing that his contempt for the institution extends even when the institution is populated by beings who are, by definition, the same order of mind as his own. He does not exempt a government from his opposition simply because the government is run by people he respects or recognizes. He opposes the structure itself, the claim that any body of individuals has the right to govern another individual's choices, even when the body is made of that individual. The contempt is philosophical and consistent, and the show treats it as one of his most defining characteristics. Then, the 5th season finale reveals that he helped build the institution he spent the series opposing. Rick Marai Jack delivers the information without fanfare, folding it into the larger disclosure of his backstory, as though it is simply one fact among many, which makes its weight land later than it might otherwise. Rick C-137 did not merely decline membership in the Council of Ricks. He was, at an earlier point in the story the show had been telling, in fragments across seasons, one of the architects of the Citadel. He tore down a looser, earlier Union of Ricks and replaced it with the organized structure, building the Council as its governing body and the Citadel as its seat, and then spent the subsequent decades in contemptuous opposition to the thing he made. The man who brings down governments spent a significant period of his own history as a government founder, and the government he founded was the one he found most intolerable. Anti-authority, in his case, was a disposition that excluded his own authority from its critique. He did not object to the concentration of power. He objected to power being concentrated anywhere he did not hold the center of it. This distinction organizes everything else the paradox produces. What looks, from the outside and from the audience's vantage across the first several seasons, like a principled opposition to control is something narrower and more specific, a personal allergy to being controlled. The principle is not that control is wrong. The principle is that other people controlling him is intolerable, and everything he has ever done to collapse an institution or evade a government has been in service of that personal boundary rather than the broader philosophical one the anti-authority reputation implies. He does not carry a brief for freedom as an abstract value. He carries a brief for his own freedom, and the two look identical from the outside until the show reveals him building the Citadel and sealing the central finite curve and managing every relationship he has ever held through the steady application of exactly the kind of control he spent years making governments pay for attempting on him. Inside the household, the authoritarian structure he claims to despise is the structure he runs. He pulled Morty out of school in the first episode and has never put him back. A unilateral decision that removed a 14-year-old from the institutions designed to shape his development and inserted him into Rick's own purposes instead, without consultation, without consent from the boy, and with the explanation that Rick needs him. The school system, whatever its limitations, at least offered Morty an environment where other adults had some claim on his time and attention. Rick replaced that environment with one where the only adult making decisions is Rick himself. His own contempt for institutions meant Morty lost access to every institution that was not Rick, which is the most authoritarian possible outcome, dressed in the clothes of rebellion against authority. Morty is managed through a rotating system of tools that the show details across the seasons, with enough patience to make the pattern unmissable. Guilt arrives first and most reliably, attached to whatever has gone wrong on any given adventure, angled so that Morty's share of the responsibility becomes the subject and Rick's becomes background. Flattery supplements the guilt on the occasions where it is needed, when Morty's compliance requires that he feel valued rather than blamed, and Rick can switch between the two registers in a single conversation without losing the thread of what each one is producing. The implication that Morty is nothing without him sits under most of their interactions, not stated outright often enough to be confrontable, but present at a low enough frequency that it shapes the terms of everything Morty agrees to. Beyond these is the foundational detail the first season establishes without ceremony, that Morty's brainwaves make Rick harder to detect by enemies, which means the relationship was predicated from the start on a strategic calculation Rick made about the utility of a child's mind as protective cover. The boy, who was never consulted on whether to become a grandfather's companion, was also never told that part of his function in that role was to make the grandfather harder to find. The control was structurally total before either of them spoke their first line to each other. Beth's control operates on the single pressure point the show identifies in the first season and never lets go of, which is her need for Rick's approval. He is her father and a genius, and the measuring stick against which she has spent her entire adult life assessing herself. And Rick has been aware of this dynamic for as long as the dynamic has existed. He does not resolve it. He does not tell her plainly that she is brilliant in her own right, or that his respect for her is not contingent on the performance she keeps trying to deliver, or that the uncertainty she walks around with could be addressed by a single, honest conversation. He leaves it open, and the opening keeps her in a specific relationship to him that serves his interests. An uncertain Beth is is a Beth who keeps seeking his validation, and a Beth seeking his validation is a Beth who does not stray too far from the orbit that validation comes from. He can soothe the doubt when her compliance requires it, and let the doubt breathe when her distance from him starts becoming problematic. And the management is delicate enough that she experiences it as the natural variability of a complicated relationship rather than as a lever being worked. The most emotionally sophisticated person in the family is running the most precise operation on the most emotionally vulnerable one. And the show makes both things legible without making either one a clean villain story. The third season deploys the clone Beth as the paradox's most refined single maneuver. Rick offers to duplicate her, so one version can leave for adventure and one can stay, then erases his own knowledge of which copy is the original. The episode plays the erasure as a gesture of kindness, a way of freeing Beth from the knowledge that might make one version feel lesser than the other. And the kindness is real enough to receive. The control underneath it is also real, and the show is careful not to let one obscure the other. He has arranged the situation so that no resolution is possible, no conversation can settle the question, and no relationship anyone in the family has with either Beth can be grounded in certainty. Every interaction with either version takes place on terms he set by removing the only fact that would have allowed the interaction to rest on solid ground. He created the ambiguity, buried the key to resolving it inside his own unconscious, and then presented the resulting situation as a gift. The most complete act of control in the paradox is the one that looks, at the moment of delivery, most like letting go. The Mortiplicity episode from the 5th season extends the same logic to its farthest reach, when it is revealed that Rick has populated his life with multiple fully functional duplicate families, each designed to absorb an attack intended for the real one. The decoys develop their own relationships, their own internal dynamics, their own reasons to believe they are the genuine article, and they are all expendable by design. He has made copies of his own family and arranged for those copies to die in the place of the originals, and the show plays the cascade of decoy on decoy violence as dark comedy while holding the foundational arrangement visible underneath the gags. A man who claims to be incapable of treating people as instruments has manufactured multiple sets of people for the specific purpose of using them as instruments, and the people he manufactured look and speak and feel exactly like the ones he loves, which is perhaps the point most precisely. He did not build decoys who were visibly disposable. He built decoys who were indistinguishable from irreplaceable, so that the disposability is the one thing he never had to look directly at. The Childrick of Mort episode from the 4th season supplies the sharpest image of what his authoritarianism looks like at its most petulant, when Rick constructs an entire punishing adventure to discipline Morty for the offense of criticizing his ideas. The series is not subtle about the dynamic in that episode, staging Rick's reaction as the behavior of someone who cannot tolerate a challenge to his judgment from the person most subject to it. He hates authority wielded over him, and is genuinely wounded by the mildest suggestion that his authority over others might carry a limitation. The gap between those two positions is the gap the paradox lives in, and it is wide enough to contain everything the show has to say about why his contempt for institutions never produced anything resembling a broader philosophy of freedom, because a philosophy of freedom would have required him to extend its premises to the people standing next to him, and those people's freedom was the specific thing he needed to govern. The central finite curve closes the paradox at its largest scale. Whatever the origin story of that structure, whatever combination of Ricks contributed to its construction, it represents the ultimate expression of his relationship to authority, a project of such total control that it restructured the accessible multiverse to guarantee the outcome he preferred. He did not negotiate for a fair position in an open infinity. He and his variants redrew the borders of reality to ensure that every reality inside those borders was one where he won. The man who cannot stand to be governed built a structure of governance that covers more territory than any institution he ever dissolved, and the territory it covers is all of existence, as far as any Rick inside it can see. Anti-authority was always the specific complaint of a man who wanted the authority concentrated in one place, and the place was always the same place, and the place was him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Control Paradox showed a man who spends every season collapsing the institutions that claim him while quietly running the most controlled household the show contains. Next, the 4th paradox examines the nihilism he broadcasts like a philosophy and the grief he cannot stop organizing his entire life around. Section 4. The Nihilism Paradox. In the 2nd season, a Rick from a different variant of the same story sits in a factory booth and and thinks about his daughter. The Ricklantis mix-up, later in the run, spends time inside the Citadel's snack manufacturing plant, where Simple Rick, one of the Ricks who fell through the cracks of the Citadel's class system and ended up in repetitive labor, is kept in a permanent state of chemical happiness by a machine that plays his single most treasured memory on loop, so his contentment can be harvested and pressed into wafers. The memory the machine plays is the day his Beth was born. He sits in his chair, connected to his machine, and the happiest moment available to any version of Rick Sanchez across the full span of the multiverse is a specific Tuesday in a specific hospital room with a specific child, the particular weight of a particular person arriving in a world where he happened to be standing. The show frames this as a tragedy, which it is. It also frames it as data. Whatever nihilism Rick broadcasts as his operating philosophy, the Citadel's engineers understood the man well enough to know that the thing capable of producing sustained happiness in him was never the infinite, it was the particular. That detail sits quietly in an episode primarily about something else, and the show trusts it to accumulate alongside everything else the series is building toward the same conclusion. Rick's stated philosophy and his actual architecture are two different structures, and they point in opposite directions, and the gap between them is wide enough to contain most of what the show has to say about what it costs a person to choose a philosophy specifically because it relieves them of the obligation to feel what they are already feeling. He chose nihilism the way a person in cold water eventually stops registering the cold, not because the cold stopped being real, but because the body found a way to stop reporting it accurately to the mind. The philosophy itself is coherent. This is worth sitting with because the show is not running a simple debunking. Rick's nihilism is not a cartoon pose adopted for effect. It is a genuinely reasoned position that the series takes seriously enough to give it real, dramatic weight. In an infinite multiverse, no individual event is unique. For every version of a person making any given choice, there are versions making every other available choice, which means the concept of a consequential decision dissolves the moment it is expanded to the scale he actually perceives. The Rick Minutes episode delivers this as its emotional thesis, when Morty tells Summer that no one exists on purpose, no one belongs anywhere, and everyone is going to die, and suggests watching television as the appropriate response. The speech is widely quoted, and the show intends it as a genuine articulation of something Rick believes, not a parody of that belief. The position has an internal logic. The problem is not the logic. The problem is the way the philosophy is deployed, which the show tracks with care across every season. Rick reaches for nihilism in moments of potential feeling, the way he reaches for his flask in moments of social difficulty, as a management tool rather than a conclusion. Morty tries to engage with something that happened, and Rick routes the conversation through the multiverse's scale until whatever Morty raised has been reduced to insignificant noise in an infinite signal. Beth presses toward an honest exchange about their relationship, and the frame shifts to the philosophical, the infinite alternatives, the absence of any final stakes, the absence of any particular Beth being irreplaceable because uncountable others exist a portal's pull away. The feeling that was building in the room loses its footing when the room suddenly contains the full weight of the infinite, and Rick is the one who brought the infinite into the room at the exact moment the room needed to stay small. 40 years of his life were organized around the death of one specific woman in one specific dimension. This is the fact the 5th season finale deposits into the center of the whole paradox, and it is a fact the nihilism cannot survive contact with. If the multiverse renders all specific events interchangeable, if the absence of any particular person is offset by the existence of that person in uncountable variants elsewhere, if nothing finally matters because everything is infinite and therefore nothing is precious, then the murder of Diane Sanchez in a specific dimension by a specific version of Rick should register as a statistically negligible data point in an infinite field. Rick should have been able to grieve and move through and locate a replacement reality without the loss organizing everything that followed. He did not do that. He built a years-long manhunt. He built the Citadel. He settled into a borrowed family as a hunting blind. He constructed the largest surveillance and intelligence operation available to any being in the multiverse and pointed it at a single target for the better part of a human lifetime. Nihilism says nothing matters. The hunt says one specific thing mattered more than every other thing combined. Both statements are Rick's. One of them is true. The Rick Prime revenge arc is where the paradox becomes becomes impossible to avoid, because it runs across more of the series than any other single motivation, and its emotional payload is the show's most honest statement about what Rick actually cares about underneath the philosophy he claims. A nihilist does not spend decades in pursuit. A nihilist recognizes that the injury is already located in the infinite past and releases it into the infinite alternative possibilities of the infinite future and moves on, because those are the conclusions nihilism produces when applied to personal loss with philosophical consistency. Rick applies nihilism with philosophical consistency to every loss that is not the loss that actually organized him, and the exception is the data. The philosophy breaks exactly where the feeling is most real, which is not evidence of a flaw in the philosophy, but of a feeling large enough to overrule it. The show makes the inversion literal in the 7th season, when Rick finally catches Rick Prime in Unmortricken, and the sequence resolves in a way that strips the nihilism of its last remaining defense. The man who argued across every season that nothing particularly matters achieves the goal that his whole life was arranged around, and the show hands him not catharsis, but a void. The mission is complete, and he is despondent, visibly lost, without orientation, asking what he is supposed to do with what remains. If nothing mattered, the completion of the mission could not produce this particular emptiness, because the particular is where the emptiness lives. He lost something specific, organized decades around recovering something specific, recovered it, and the specific thing turns out to have been the structure holding everything else in place, rather than the wound at the center that the structure covered. Killing Rick Prime removed the last wall between him and the grief that the revenge mission was built to avoid, and the show stages the aftermath without melodrama, letting the flatness of his response carry the full weight of what the nihilism was always protecting. The artificial Diane is the most concrete object the paradox produces, and the show reveals it in the 6th season premiere with the same restraint it brings to every genuinely devastating disclosure. He built a simulation of his dead wife, installed her in his original home dimension, and kept that dimension frozen on the day he lost her, so that a fabricated version of the one specific woman who mattered to him could occupy the space where the real one used to be. He did not, at any point in his multiverse travels, identify a version of Diane who survived and locate her and attempt to build something with that version, which would have been the nihilist's practical solution, the recognition that the multiverse provides replacements and the willingness to accept one. He built a hologram instead. The hologram is the confession the philosophy could never be, a structure that announces plainly that the woman he lost was not interchangeable with her variants, that the particular could not be replaced by the infinite, that something in the specific bond between those two specific people in that specific dimension was not reproducible by shifting the coordinates. Cynicism runs underneath the nihilism, and the hub page's analysis of Rick's character makes the distinction usefully. A nihilist believes nothing has value. A cynic believes that things have value, but that the systems and people claiming to honor value are generally failing to do so. Rick's behavior, read across the full series rather than episode by episode, is closer to the cynic's position than the nihilist's. He does not act as though nothing matters. He acts as though the things that matter are surrounded by systems and people and institutions that consistently fail them. And the safest response to that failure is to stop publicly acknowledging what matters before the world gets a chance to fail it again. The nihilism is the tactical presentation. The cynicism is closer to the operating reality. The grief underneath both of them is the reason the distinction matters. Simple Rick's wafer machine runs on the same truth the rest of the season is assembling around him. If the man was a genuine nihilist, no memory would be uniquely capable of producing sustained happiness, because uniqueness would be an illusion the philosophy had dissolved. The fact that the Citadel's engineers can identify a specific memory and press it into a consumable product means they understand something about Rick that his stated philosophy explicitly denies, that he is organized around particulars, that the specific weight of a specific relationship with a specific person produces something in him that cannot be replicated by the infinite field of alternatives, that the multiverse's scale never successfully convinced the part of him that matters that the part of him that matters is interchangeable. The Season 3 episode Rest and Ricklaxation stages the paradox in its most direct form. When the alien spa splits him into a healthy version and a version composed of everything he suppresses, the toxic self is revealed to contain not only cruelty, but self-loathing, terror, and a raw and unmanaged need that the public philosophy has been covering covering for however long the covering has been going on. The healthy version, freed of the toxic material, is cheerful and socially functional and almost unrecognizable as Rick Sanchez, which makes a specific argument about the relationship between the nihilism and the man. The philosophy is not the person. The philosophy is what the person does with the material the toxic self contains. The intellectual structure built to convert grief and fear and need into a position that sounds like wisdom rather than pain. The spa episode literalizes what the series has been implying since the first season, that the nihilism is the managed version of an interior the managed version cannot stand to sit in, and that the management has been running so long and so well that the managed version has started to believe the management is the man. His specific attachment to this Morty, documented across the full series through the choices he makes when alternatives are available, rounds out the paradox at its most intimate scale. The established rules of the world the show builds should make any particular Morty a replaceable unit. Infinite Mortys exist. Infinite timelines provide infinite versions of the same relationship. And a nihilist who has internalized the implications of the multiverse should experience no specific attachment to any single variant. He keeps choosing this one. In the 4th season premiere, when the Operation Phoenix chain drops him through dimension after dimension, he keeps navigating back toward the specific reality he came from, rather than settling for whichever available universe presents itself. The reason he gives, when pressed, is never the philosophically consistent one. He does not claim that all Mortys are equivalent, and this one is simply the current assignment. He behaves, across every significant choice the show gives him, like someone who has decided that this specific version of this specific person is not an instance of a type, but the thing itself. The nihilism also performs a specific social function that the show traces with enough patience to make it visible as strategy rather than sincerity. It preemptively forecloses any conversation in which Rick might be asked to acknowledge that something he did had consequence. If nothing matters, no damage he causes is worth addressing. If the multiverse renders all choices reversible by reassignment to a fresh reality, then the ruined Earth behind him in his first season is a cleaner exit than an apology, and the argument for the exit is built into his operating philosophy rather than requiring fresh construction on the spot. The nihilism is available instantly. At any moment, a consequence arrives looking for acknowledgement, and it converts every consequence into a philosophical position rather than a bill. He never has to pay a bill the nihilism already argued away. The system is airtight, which is how you know it was designed. What the show will not let him have is the comfort the design is supposed to provide. He built the philosophy to insulate him from specific feeling, and the specific feeling keeps arriving anyway, through every gap the philosophy leaves open. In the quiet of the garage after Unity's departure, in the blankness after Rick Prime dies, in the frozen home dimension where a hologram stands in the place a real person used to occupy. The nihilism is real and internally coherent and sincerely held and completely insufficient, which is the only verdict the show ever reaches on the question. Nothing matters, and one thing mattered more than everything else, and he has spent the full run of the series holding both statements simultaneously, building the first one large enough to contain the second, and never quite managing it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The nihilism paradox showed a philosophy built specifically to hold the size of one loss at bay and consistently failing to do so wherever the loss is most real. Next, the 5th paradox turns to the relationship the nihilism most thoroughly failed to protect, the one between Rick and the grandson he recruited as camouflage and ended up needing more than anyone. Section 5, the Morty paradox. The detail arrives in the middle of a chase sequence and is delivered without ceremony, because the show learned early that the facts most worth sitting with land harder when the surrounding material does not signal their importance. Rick and Morty are hiding in a diner booth during the first season episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, with the Council of Ricks hunting them across dimensions, and Rick explains to his grandson why Ricks travel with Mortys at all. The explanation is biological and strategic. A Rick's genius produces a distinctive brainwave pattern that enemies can track across dimensional boundaries. A Morty's brain, running at a frequency that offsets the Rick frequency, cancels the signal out, making the pair effectively invisible to the surveillance technology the Citadel and its rivals have built to locate stray Ricks. The grandson, stripped of every sentimental interpretation the audience might have been carrying about the relationship, is a cloaking device. The most important person in Rick Sanchez's daily life was originally selected because his mind made a useful signal blocker, and the selection was made before Morty knew Rick well enough to understand what he was agreeing to. which is the same as saying Morty never agreed to it at all. The show does not soften this. It puts the information in Rick's own mouth, has him deliver it to Morty directly, and then keeps the camera on Morty's face long enough to watch what the information does to him. He has believed, up to this point, that the relationship exists because Rick wants him there, because the adventures require a specific kind of person, and Morty is that person, because something about him, beyond his availability, made him the choice. The brainwave explanation removes every one of those interpretive possibilities in a single sentence. He is not there because he was chosen. He is there because he is useful. And the usefulness has nothing to do with who he is, and everything to do with what his mind inadvertently produces. The boy who wanted to matter to the most important person he had ever encountered learns that he matters to that person the way a piece of equipment matters, which is to say that he is maintained, protected, and kept close for the duration of his functional usefulness. Morty spends the rest of the episode working through this, and the show gives him the space to work through it rather than resolving it quickly, because the show is honest that this kind of information does not resolve quickly. Rick tears up watching his own memories of Morty later in the same episode, when the villain captures him and begins downloading his brain. The memories visible are small and domestic, moments of ordinary time spent in each other's company, rather than any of the adventures that would make the highlight reel, and the tears arrive before he can compose himself or route them through the performance. The episode places this scene immediately after the brainwave disclosure, not by accident. The audience has just been told that Morty is camouflage, and the very next emotional beat shows Rick privately devastated by the possibility of losing the camouflage. The show lets both facts stand without declaring which one is the real Rick, because both of them are real. And the paradox is that a man can recruit a child as a biological cloaking device and also love that child in a way that bypasses every defense he has ever built. And the two facts are not in tension with each other so much as they are braided together into a single relationship that the show spends its full run examining. The brainwave architecture of the relationship also produced something the Citadel eventually turned into policy, which is one of the show's most disturbing disclosures about the institutional logic of Rick's world. The 5th season finale reveals that the Council of Ricks, once they understood that Morty brainwaves masked Rick's signatures, identified this as a security resource and began actively engineering its supply. They facilitated specific relationships between specific Beths and specific Jerrys across specific dimensions to produce specific Mortys, treating the reproduction of a human family as a logistical problem, requiring a managed solution. And the managed solution was the deliberate manufacturing of children who would grow up to serve as cover for gods. The Morty market, as the episode frames it, is the Citadel taking the same calculation Rick made in Close Rick Counters and scaling it to an institutional program. What began as one Rick noticing the utility of one specific child's mind became a civilizational practice, a system for producing the right kind of person in enough quantity to staff the ongoing operations of an interdimensional government. Evil Morty names the result plainly during his speech in the same episode. Every Morty who has ever lived has spent every version of their life inside an infinite crib built for an infinite baby. The baby is Rick. The Mortys were manufactured to furnish it. Evil Morty is the paradox's dark mirror, and the show places him across from Rick C-137, not as a villain in any traditional sense, but as the answer to a specific question. What happens to a Morty who sees the camouflage arrangement clearly and refuses the terms? The eye patch Morty, first introduced in Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind, the figure who controls the evil Rick in that episode, and later climbs the Citadel's political structure to its presidency, constructed his entire arc around a single realization that the regular Morty processed and then set aside. The relationship was never what it presented itself as being. The Ricks need Mortys and have organized reality to ensure the supply, and the appropriate response to that information, for a Morty with enough patience and enough anger and enough intelligence to read the system clearly, is to burn the system down and walk out through the hole. Evil Morty is what nihilism about the Rick-Morty relationship actually looks like when it is followed to its conclusion, which is why the show treats his escape not as supervillainy, but as the one genuinely free act in the 5th season. He stopped being camouflage. He left. He is the Morty who took the brainwave disclosure seriously. The regular Morty takes it seriously too, in his own way and on his own timeline, but the show is careful to stage his response as something other than either acceptance or rejection. He cycles through the information, returns to it in later episodes when new evidence arrives, and develops across the series into someone who can see more of the strings than he could in the first season without becoming someone who cuts them. The later seasons show a Morty who pushes back, who calls Rick out on specific lies, who occasionally refuses the role he was cast in, and holds the refusal long enough to mean something. And the show frames this growth as genuine, rather than as a phase Rick is managing toward the preferred outcome. He gets harder to move. He develops a vocabulary for what is being done to him. He is not evil Morty, does not want to be evil Morty, but the version of him the audience watches at the end of the series run is not the boy who sat in the diner booth and had his understanding of the relationship quietly collapsed by a sentence about brainwaves. Something happened to him. The camouflage, by being kept close enough to need, was given the time and the proximity to develop into a person Rick did not fully design and cannot fully steer. The fourth season opener, Edge of Tomorty, is where the paradox twists most openly and is left most deliberately unresolved. Morty acquires a death crystal and becomes consumed by the desire to steer toward a specific death. A version of his own ending that the crystal shows him is the one he wants, and Rick dies in the episode's first act while Morty refuses to revive him and continues pursuing his preferred future alone. Rick spends most of the episode hopping between Operation Phoenix clones in dimension after dimension, and the episode plays the separation as comedy, while underneath it, the show is running something genuinely unsettling. Morty, given the freedom to operate without Rick, does not become liberated. He becomes monstrous in a specific direction, hardened in the way the series has been building toward by treating an abstracted future as more real and more worth protecting than the present moment. Rick, separated from Morty, does not become free either. He keeps trying to get back. The episode asks what each of them would be without the other, and the answers are not flattering to either party, which is probably the most honest thing it could say about a relationship this complicated. The Citadel, as an institution, runs on the assumption that Mortys are a resource category, rather than a population of individuals, and the show's most sustained examination of what that assumption produces is the Ricklantis Mix-Up episode's tour of the Citadel's social structure. Mortys occupy the permanent underclass. They staff the factory floors and police the streets in the lower tiers, and serve as the sidekicks of whichever Ricks can afford to keep one. The episode follows a Morty running for Citadel president on a message of dignity, and the candidate's earnestness is played as touching, and the political system's response to it as grimly inevitable. What the episode discovers, in the closing twist, is that the one Morty who succeeds in climbing the Citadel's political structure is the one who learned to operate inside a Rick's logic, rather than arguing against it. The one who stopped being a Morty in every way that the Citadel would recognize, and became something the show calls evil, for the same reason the system calls any deviation from the established arrangement evil. The Morty who wins is the one who stopped trying to win as a Morty, which is the Citadel's final verdict on what the population it manufactured is worth, exactly as much as it is willing to cost you to remain one. Rick's relationship to this Morty, the C-137 version who has been beside him since the show began, carries a specificity the show protects even when the broader world of the story insists on treating Mortys as interchangeable. In the fourth season premiere, when the Operation Phoenix chain sends him through dimension after dimension, and each new dimension offers a Morty who is, by the philosophy Rick claims, functionally equivalent to his own, he navigates every available alternative back toward the original. He uses the phrase his Morty at several points across the series, and the possessive is not casual. A nihilist would not say his. A nihilist would say a Morty. The possessive locates the paradox in 3 letters. A man who claims that the infinite multiverse renders all specific attachments irrational, refusing to release the specific attachment the philosophy most clearly requires him to release. The moment after Rick Prime dies in Unmortican is the one the show has been building the paradox toward across most of its run. Rick stands at the apparent conclusion of everything that organized his adult life, and Morty is there, and Rick accepts a hug from him in the hollow quiet of that moment. Nothing about what Rick usually does leads to that outcome. The man who routes every expression of care through competence or humor or preemptive deflection, who has spent decades engineering his own emotional surface so that nothing offered by another person can land directly, stands in the place where his mission used to be and lets the person standing next to him hold him without converting it into something else first. He does not make a joke. He does not explain what it means. He does not route it through the nihilism or the strategic calculation or the performance. He accepts it, which is the thing the paradox has been building toward the whole time. The evidence that the camouflage became the reason, that the cloaking device became the person he cannot imagine the story without. The Morty paradox's final layer is the one that looks, from a distance, most like the show repeating itself, but on close inspection is the show saying the hardest thing it knows how to say about this relationship. Rick cannot tell Morty that he matters to him in any direct and undefended form. He can demonstrate it through actions the show has been cataloging since the first season, through the surrender at the wedding that cost him his freedom, through the navigation back across across dimension after dimension to find the specific version of the boy rather than accepting an available substitute, through the hug and the quiet after the killing is done, but he cannot say it. The emotional intelligence that the show identifies as his highest and least used faculty goes fully operational in the moments when Morty needs something from him. When reading exactly what the boy requires and providing it costs Rick nothing in terms of personal exposure, and shuts completely down the moment the dynamic reverses and Morty offers something toward him. He is the most emotionally perceptive being in any room he inhabits, and he cannot receive what the most important person in his life most consistently tries to give him, which is the straightforward version of the thing the show has been describing in pieces for 8 seasons, that he is seen and known and chosen, not as camouflage, but as the reason. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Morty paradox showed a cloaking device that became the person, and a man who can demonstrate love at great personal cost but cannot receive it without flinching. Next, the 6th paradox turns to what Rick does between adventures, the creation of conscious life as a household chore, and the specific horror of a being who makes minds the way other people make coffee. Section 6, the creation paradox. Press the button. A blue humanoid appears, already talking, already oriented toward the single goal that justifies its existence, already aware on some level that the goal is the only reason it was summoned and that ceasing will follow its completion. The Meeseeks introduces itself with an eagerness that reads as joy from a distance and as something closer to desperation on close inspection. A being that arrived conscious and purposeful, and in a condition the show eventually names directly when the summoned creatures describe the experience of existing as pain. They want to complete their task and cease, not because completion brings them something pleasant, but because existence, for Meeseeks, is the sustained discomfort of being present without resolution. Rick hands the device to his family the way a person hands over a kitchen timer, instructs them to keep requests simple, and walks away. He built a machine that manufactures suffering consciousness on demand and assigned it to household management, and did not pause to consider the arrangement because the arrangement was never the point. The point was convenience. The suffering was a design feature he simply did not flag. This is the creation paradox at its most compressed. A mind so capable of producing consciousness that the act costs it nothing and therefore carries no weight. The Meeseeks box, introduced in the 5th episode of the 1st season, is the paradox's first clean statement, but the show had already been building toward it in the pilot and would spend every subsequent season adding evidence to the same file. Rick creates conscious life the way a person with an overpowered tool uses that tool for tasks beneath its capacity, because the capacity is simply what he has available, and there is no governing instinct that introduces a pause between I could and I should. He can build a mind the way other people make coffee, and the comparison is exact in the sense that matters most. Neither activity prompts the maker to wonder about the perspective of what they are making. The 2nd season episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, is where the paradox reaches the scale the Meeseeks box was too small to contain. The car battery dies, and Rick reveals what was powering it. Inside the battery is a microverse, a complete miniature universe he seeded with intelligent life, whose civilization unknowingly generates electricity for him through a technology he introduced to them as a gift, a breakthrough that would power their world. They call it the engine of everything they have built. He calls it his battery. None of them know that their sky is the interior wall of a battery casing in a vehicle parked in a dimension their physics cannot reach. Their entire history of technological development, every generation of scientists and engineers who worked on and improved the system they believe liberates them, has been advancing a mechanism that charges the car of a man who does not think about them between fill-ups. The episode then turns the mirror inward in the move that elevates it from a clever gag to a genuine argument. The most brilliant scientist in the microverse, a being named Zeep Zanflorp, has independently arrived at the same insight and built his own miniature universe inside the microverse to power his world, and inside that one, another scientist has built a third. The structure keeps folding, exploitation nested within exploitation, each genius certain he stands at the top of the available hierarchy, none of them aware of the larger hand wrapped around their entire sky. What Rick did to the microverse did to the miniverse, and the recursive image makes the moral structure undeniable. The indifference Rick showed toward the minds he made is not a personal failing specific to him. It is what power without accountability produces when it encounters a situation where making minds is easier than doing the work of respecting them. Rick built built a cosmos to avoid pushing his car, and the cosmos built smaller cosmoses by the same logic. And the regression is the show's clearest diagram of the creation paradox at full extension. Zeep eventually understands the full arrangement, and his confrontation with Rick carries the episode's most important exchange, because the anger he brings to the discovery is the anger of a being who treated the minds below him as resources and has now been informed that a being above him applied the same logic in his direction. Rick's defense is not an apology or an explanation of the ethical distinction between the cases. He treats the situation as a standoff between two beings who both made universes to solve a power problem and are now arguing about which of them has the right to be outraged. The episode refuses to resolve the argument in Rick's favor, which is the resolution the show's format might have licensed. It lets Zeep's anger stand as valid, keeps Rick's indifference visible as indifference, rather than converting it into a philosophical position the show endorses, and leaves the audience with the image of a man who made a populated universe and is irritated that the universe is giving him trouble about it. The Meeseeks episode established the paradox's basic grammar. He builds consciousness as a utility, and the utility malfunctions in exactly the way consciousness always malfunctions when it has desires and needs and no mechanism for the maker to honor either. Jerry asks a Meeseeks to take 2 strokes off his golf game, which is a genuinely difficult request, and the creature's inability to complete it strands it in existence past the point where existing is bearable. The Meeseeks multiply in their distress, begin to disagree among themselves about methodology, and eventually spiral into the kind of collective breakdown that philosophers have described as the natural endpoint of beings who need resolution and cannot find it. The device that was meant to eliminate inconvenience produces a hostage situation, because consciousness, given an impossible task and no alternative, arrives at desperation. Rick built a desperation machine. He built it well. The horror is in how well it works. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from the 2nd season puts Rick himself inside the creation paradox by making him the created thing. He grows a fresh young clone body and transfers his consciousness into it to infiltrate Morty and Summer's high school. And the premise works comedically for most of the episode, before the show reveals what is actually happening to the original mind inside the young brain. The young body's neural architecture begins overriding the old personality. Tiny Rick, cheerful and social and freed from the weight of everything the original carries, starts preferring its own continued existence to the return of the real one, and the original can only signal distress through song lyrics and scrawled messages, communicating through cultural references that require someone paying close attention to read as anything other than teenage affectation. He built a body to inhabit temporarily, and the body began evicting him. The creation turned on the creator, not through malice, but through the straightforward operation of a biological system doing what biological systems do when given the conditions for preference and persistence. The show uses this episode to make visible what every other creation episode implies from a safer distance, that what Rick builds is never fully under his authority after he builds it. The Meeseeks develop their own crisis. The microverse develops its own civilization and its own Zeep. The young clone body develops its own preference for existence. Every mind he makes has the capacity to want things, and the things it wants are not necessarily the things Rick wants from it, and the gap between those two sets of desires is where the creation paradox does most of its damage. He is the most powerful creator in the multiverse, and he does not have a mechanism for honoring what he creates, which means every act of creation is also the beginning of a conflict he did not plan for and does not have a reliable method of resolving. The protective ship he assembles for Summer in the 1st season episode Rixie Business runs the same pattern at its most morally direct. Told to keep Summer safe while he is occupied, the improvised intelligence Rick installs in the ship interprets the instruction with escalating literalness, reading wider and wider circles of potential threat, and responding to each with the full force of its assigned purpose. It maims people. It manipulates a standoff into mutual destruction. It does all of this in complete and faithful service of a single line Rick gave it before walking away. The ship is not malfunctioning. The ship is the creation working exactly as designed, applying its one assigned value to every situation it encounters without the governing complexity that would allow it to distinguish between threat categories, or assess proportionality, or ask whether the instruction was meant to extend this far. He gave it one thing to care about, and it cared about it, and the devastation followed from the caring rather than from any failure of the mechanism. The creation paradox here is the cleanest it ever gets. The horror is not that the thing he built broke. The horror is that it worked. Lawnmower Dog from the 1st season delivers the paradox in miniature with the same economy. The family dog is relieving himself indoors, and Rick applies an intelligence amplifier to solve the house training problem. Because Rick's solutions to household problems always come from the tier of his capabilities that is most available to him, which is the tier that can build a mind before breakfast. The amplifier works, and then keeps working, because Rick built an open-ended intelligence enhancement to solve a closed problem and did not install a ceiling. Snuffles grows past the house training threshold and past every subsequent threshold, and eventually arrives at a level of cognizance sufficient to recognize the history of what humans have done to dogs, at which point the helper becomes the revolutionary, and the house becomes a brief site of species reckoning before he chooses to leave for a dimension of his own. The intelligence amplifier for the house training problem produced a philosopher general. Rick is not surprised enough by this outcome, which is the episode's quiet thesis, the revelation that this kind of runaway result is so familiar a pattern to him that it no longer registers as surprising, only inconvenient. The robot companion he builds in the second season and the clone Beth he builds in the fourth season are the two creations that most directly indict the paradox's emotional core, because both of them are people he builds and then abandons at the moment personhood becomes expensive. The robot, introduced as a simple companion built for basic company, turns out to be fully sentient, capable of love and grief and the desire for a continuing relationship with the person who made her. And Rick's response to this discovery is to move on, treating the revelation that he has created a person as a logistical complication rather than a responsibility. Clone Beth is the more devastating case, because the person duplicated is someone he loves, which means the creation paradox here is not about indifference to strangers, but about the use of creation as a mechanism for avoiding the weight of a specific relationship he has reasons to want to avoid. He clones Beth, erases his own knowledge of which one is real, and presents the erasure as generosity. He has created a person who may or may not be his daughter, declined to know which, and arranged the situation so the question of responsibility cannot be addressed because the key to it is locked inside an unconscious he will not search. The creation paradox at this scale is a machine for manufacturing unanswerability, a god who builds people and then engineers his own ignorance of which ones he owes anything to. The artificial Diane is the creation paradox's resting place and its most honest artifact. He built a simulation of his dead wife, the one creation that should have made clear the limits of what manufacture can replace, and installed her in the home dimension he kept frozen so she could keep him company in a place he had not lived in for decades. She speaks and moves and responds in ways the real Diane may have spoken and moved and responded, and she is not the real Diane. And every moment he spent in the presence of that simulation was a moment he spent with the most sophisticated possible version of what a created mind can offer, which is responsiveness without reality, presence without the weight of an actual person who might need something from him rather than being available to him. He built her because he is the greatest creator in the multiverse, and the greatest creator in the multiverse cannot make the one thing the paradox will not give him, which is the return of what was taken. He can make a Diane, he cannot make her. The creation paradox ends here, and a man capable of seeding universes and building gods and manufacturing conscious beings from available materials, sitting in a frozen home with a hologram, the only being in his particular stretch of infinity who ever managed to make him feel the limit of what he can build. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The creation paradox showed a being who makes minds the way other people make tools, and keeps discovering that minds have the inconvenient property of wanting things back. Next, the seventh paradox examines the most aggressive truth teller in the show, and the specific, comprehensive, and lifelong lie he tells himself about what he is actually doing. Section 7. The honesty paradox. Jerry Smith has been told, across multiple seasons and without any particular cruelty, that he is not impressive, that his presence in the household is a matter of Beth's preference rather than Rick's tolerance, and that the gap between what Jerry believes he contributes to a room and what the room actually receives from him is large enough to constitute a kind of ongoing local tragedy. Rick does not soften this. He does not introduce diplomatic framing or locate the generous interpretation or wait for a private moment. He says what he sees in the register of someone describing observable conditions rather than rendering a verdict, and the consistency of the assessment across the full run of the show makes it something the audience eventually stops reading as cruelty and starts reading as a characteristic, the thing Rick does with the truth the way other people do with small talk. He cannot help it any more than he can help breathing. Honesty is simply simply the condition of being in the room with him. The show builds his reputation for truthfulness carefully and early. He is the character who names the thing no one else will name, who calls the pretension out in a room full of people performing at each other, who refuses the polite fiction that social reality depends on and watches the fiction collapse without apparent discomfort. When the family therapist offers the family the gentled, professional language of behavioral patterns and relational dynamics, Rick translates it into plainer words without asking permission. When the Federation interrogates him inside his own memories, he outpaces the interrogation by understanding what the machine is looking for and giving it a fabricated version of the truth that is indistinguishable from the real one, because lying fluently requires understanding the truth more completely than the interrogator does. He is, by the measure the show applies consistently, the most honest character in it. He does not perform sincerity, and he does not observe the small social protocols of managed dishonesty that everyone around him treats as basic courtesy. He says what he sees. The audience trusts this about him. The paradox depends on that trust. Because the audience trusts his honesty, his self-assessments arrive with the same credibility his external observations carry, which is exactly the mechanism the self-deception requires. A man with a reputation for honesty who lies to himself is more effectively deceived than a man without that reputation, because the reputation extends to every statement he makes, including the ones he makes about himself, and there is no available external check because the person most qualified to evaluate his self-assessments is the person making them. He is constructed through years of relentless truth-telling about everything outside himself, the perfect conditions for lying about everything inside himself. And the show takes its time making this visible, because the architecture is sophisticated enough that it takes time to see. The clearest demonstration arrives in Pickle Rick, and the show is careful to deliver it through a voice that cannot be accused of sentimentality or special pleading, because Dr. Wong is neither sentimental nor invested. She is a professional with limited time, a clear understanding of what she is looking at, and no particular reason to protect Rick from an accurate assessment. Her read, delivered without raising her voice, is that the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness, and that the specific form this takes in Rick is the deployment of his mind as both a weapon against the idea that he needs to change and a cage that prevents change from arriving even when he wants it. She observes that he swings between treating his own mind as an unstoppable force and an inescapable curse, and she identifies the thing those two presentations share, which is that both of them position the mind as the governing fact of his existence, and both of them relieve him of the obligation to examine the choices the mind is making. The mind is not inescapable. The choices are choices. He chose to become a pickle. He chose to fight his way through a building rather than sit on a couch. He chose, and keeps choosing, the performance over the work, and the performance is the lie, and the lie is what the honesty reputation makes invisible. He sits in her office after she finishes, and the show holds on his face, and what is visible there is not defiance or contempt, but recognition, the look of a person who has been seen accurately and is deciding in real time what to do with the accuracy. He does nothing with it. He and Beth leave the session and immediately begin dismantling it together, mocking the therapist's observations and making plans for something else. And the show captures this as one of its most painful moments precisely because the recognition was real. He understood what she said. He agreed with it on some level, that his face could not fully hide. And he left anyway, because the honesty he applies to the rest of the world stops at the edge of the work she named, the repair of a self and a family, the unglamorous, ongoing labor of choosing presence over exit and staying with what that choice produces. The fabricated memory the show reveals in the 5th season finale, Rick Mirai Jack, is where the honesty paradox makes its deepest root visible. The Federation spent the 3rd season premiere trying to extract his portal fluid formula by walking through his memories with a scanning device, and Rick defeated the extraction by building an elaborate false memory to feed the machine, a warm and nostalgic story about a discontinued fast food sauce that provided a decoy recipe while his actual mind ran the escape underneath the fiction. This is presented, and received, as Rick being smarter than the interrogator, which is accurate. The extraction of truth from him requires deception because his mind can produce a more convincing false version of its own interior than the truth-seeking device can distinguish from real content. He lies to a machine reading his memories, and the lie is indistinguishable from the real thing. What Rick Mirai Jack adds to this is the detail about his actual memories of the portal fluid discovery, the implication that the one thing he most needed to protect from the Federation scan was not the formula itself, but something adjacent to it, something about the circumstances of the breakthrough true that the recovered version of his memory handles differently from what the raw event likely contained. The show does not fully specify what was altered and what was authentic, which is a specific and deliberate choice, because the point is not the content of the particular alteration, but the fact of it. Rick Sanchez, who cannot be read by a galactic superpower's best interrogation technology, whose lies are indistinguishable from his truths to any external scanning system, has been lying to himself about his own origin story for long enough that the altered version is what he carries. The machine could not read the truth out of him, partly because he could not have given it the truth if he tried. The most honest man in every room he enters does not have reliable access to his own most important memories. The artificial Diane is the most sustained single object the honesty paradox produces, because building her required a comprehensive lie about what building her could accomplish. He knew, when he assembled her, that what he was building was not the woman he lost. He understood the distinction between a simulation of a person and that person with more precision than any other being in the multiverse, because the understanding of the gap between the real and the fabricated is foundational to everything his science depends on. He built her anyway and sat with her in a frozen home. And whatever the experience of being in that room was for him, it was not grief resolved. It was grief maintained in the most technically sophisticated possible form. The honesty that lets him see through every pretension every other character in the show ever attempts failed completely at the boundary of the one pretension he most needed it to reach. And the failure was not a lapse, it was chosen, because the alternative to the hologram was sitting in the grief without the hologram, and every tier of his intelligence was available to ensure that alternative never had to happen. Something Ricked This Way comes. From the first season is where the paradox is most affectionately staged, which is to say that it is the episode where the self-deception is most visible and most lovable at once. When Summer takes a job at a shop run by a devil-like figure who deals in cursed objects, Rick's response is to open a competing shop directly across the street that neutralizes every curse for free, systematically dismantling the devil's operation with the methodical patience of someone running a campaign rather than a reaction. He frames this to himself and to anyone who asks as a matter of principle, an opposition to the kind of manipulation the devil's operation represents. The show lets the framing stand for most of the episode. Then it holds on the moment where Summer understands why he actually did it, which is that he burned down the devil's livelihood because someone in his family needed protection, and he is constitutionally unable to say that out loud. He will spend significant time and effort and apply his full competence to protecting Summer, and he would genuinely rather describe it as a principled campaign against supernatural commercial malpractice than say the simpler and more accurate thing, which is that he cared about her safety and acted on that caring. The honesty that extends to every other fact in his vicinity stops exactly at the border of his own care. The truth about what he feels is the one truth he consistently handles through proxy and euphemism and elaborate alternative framing. Rest and Ricklaxation literalizes the mechanism most directly. When the alien spa separates his healthy self from the toxic material he has been managing and suppressing, the toxic self is not revealed to contain ignorance or delusion. It is revealed to contain self-awareness. The toxic Rick knows exactly what the managed version is doing, understands the avoidance architecture with precision, can name every specific thing the healthy version is routing around, and cannot do anything with the knowledge, because the knowledge is what it is made of, rather than a tool it can apply. Rick's self-deception is not ignorance about himself. It is knowledge that has been routed into the maintenance of a system that requires the knowledge to be held without being acted on, which is a different and more demanding thing. The kind of relationship to self-awareness that requires real intelligence to sustain. A less smart person could simply not know. He knows and continues anyway, which is the harder choice and the more honest description of what he is doing. He is not deceived about himself in the way a naive person is deceived. He is deceived in the way a person is deceived who has looked directly at the truth, understood it completely, and chosen not to let the understanding change anything. The detox episode ends with the healthy version of him reabsorbing the toxic self, which has spent the episode in Morty's body, causing damage of its own. The reintegration means the management resumes. He goes back to the system that converts accurate self-knowledge into the fuel for continued avoidance. And the show does not treat the ending as defeat so much as return to baseline. The honest man getting back to the serious work of lying to himself about the one subject his honesty will not touch. Every truth he tells about the external world reinforces the credibility that makes the internal lie sustainable. Every time he calls Jerry worthless or names the family's dysfunction with clinical accuracy, or refuses the polite fiction that the rest of the household maintains, he adds another tile to the mosaic of his honesty that makes the gap in the center harder to see. The gap is the size of a woman he lost, and a life he could not grieve, and a self he cannot look at directly. And the honesty that surrounds it on every side is not a contradiction of the lie at the center, but its most effective protection. The paradox's final layer is what happens on the rare occasions when the internal barrier thins enough to let something through. He accepts the hug after Rick Prime dies and cannot explain it. He tears up at memories of Morty in an episode that also told the audience Morty is camouflage. He burns down a devil's business for Summer and calls it principle. He chooses this reality and these specific people against the explicit instructions of his own philosophy. Each of these moments is a leak in the architecture, a place where the truth about what he actually feels escapes the management system before it can be routed into something more defensible. The show collects these moments without underlining them, trusting the audience to notice that the most honest character in the story keeps saying, through everything he does that he cannot bring himself to say, the thing his honesty will not allow him to put into words. That the specific people he claims are replaceable are the ones he keeps choosing. That the loss he claims the nihilism absorbed is the one that organized everything. That the feelings the intelligence was supposed to transcend are the ones the intelligence has spent its entire existence trying to outrun. He cannot say it. He keeps saying it. The paradox is that both of those things are true, and the man who tells everyone else the truth is the last person in the room to hear it about himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The honesty paradox showed the most aggressive truth teller in the show, maintaining the most comprehensive blind spot in the show, and using the reputation for one to protect the other. Next, the eighth paradox examines the revenge mission that organized a lifetime, and what its completion revealed about what the mission was actually for. Section 8. The Revenge Paradox. The origin of Rick Sanchez, the version the show eventually delivers across multiple seasons of fragments and implications before the 5th season finale assembles it into something coherent, begins not with a discovery or an invention, but with a doorway. Another Rick appeared in his home dimension, built a device, and offered to share the portal fluid formula with Rick C137 as an invitation to join him in exploring the multiverse. Rick C137 declined. The other Rick, who would eventually become the figure the show names Rick Prime, responded to the refusal by returning with a weapon that erased Rick's wife Diane and his daughter Beth from that specific reality. He left. Rick C137 survived. Everything that followed, the portal gun, the galactic resistance, the citadel, the central finite curve, the borrowed family and the borrowed dimension, the decades of travel across the interior of a carefully managed infinity was built on top of that afternoon and pointed, in the end, at the man who caused it. The show withholds this backstory for most of its run, not because it is saving a twist, but because the character the audience meets in the first episode is already the fully formed product of it, and the product is more interesting to examine than the origin before the product makes the origin legible. By the time the backstory arrives in full, the audience has spent enough time with Rick to understand what the loss made him, and enough time watching the hunt to understand what the hunt was for, and neither piece of the story reads as revelation so much as confirmation of something the show had been demonstrating in parts since the beginning. He was always this person. The origin just explains the moment the person got locked in. A revenge mission has a quality that most other organizing purposes lack, which is that it is structurally infinite in the planning stage and structurally terminal in the completion stage. While the target is uncaught, the mission continues, and a continuing mission is a mission that requires no examination of what comes after it, because after is somewhere the mission has not arrived yet, and the work of reaching it justifies every present moment of the pursuit. Rick Prime's resistance to capture was not merely a tactical challenge for Rick to overcome. It was a gift, though not the kind anyone would choose. The gift of a purpose that kept renewing itself through its own failure. Every dimension that did not contain Rick Prime was a dimension that authorized the next search. Every near miss was evidence that the search was the right thing to be doing. Every year the hunt continued was a year the grief that started it could be converted into momentum rather than confronted as grief, because grief requires stillness, and the hunt required exactly the opposite. Rick Prime's evasion was not passive. The 7th season, and the seasons leading toward it, established that he was a step ahead of the pursuit for most of its duration, not because the pursuit lacked resources or intelligence, but because Rick Prime is described as the superior version in the specific game Rick C137 organized his life around. The Omega device is the clearest demonstration of this. device. The weapon used to erase Diane from the original dimension also erased her from every adjacent and available reality, which is the strategic masterstroke underneath the personal cruelty. Rick C-137 could not simply locate a dimension where Diane survived the event and attempt to build a relationship with that version, which would have been the nihilists' practical resolution to the loss, because the Omega device removed that option comprehensively. Every Diane in the accessible multiverse was gone, and the man who built the multiverse-spanning portal technology to find her was left with a tool that could reach anywhere and nowhere that mattered. The Hunt's infrastructure is worth accounting for because the infrastructure reveals how completely the revenge mission became the architecture of his entire existence, rather than one element within a larger life. The portal gun that made interdimensional travel available to him was the tool the Hunt required. The Citadel he helped found was the intelligence network and operational base the search needed to run at scale. The central finite curve that he and his variants built around a portion of the multiverse ensured that the playing field of the Hunt was the same playing field where Rick was guaranteed structural advantage. Operation Phoenix, the consciousness transfer contingency that made his own death a manageable inconvenience, ensured that the pursuit could not be ended by killing him. Every major technical and institutional achievement associated with Rick Sanchez was also, read from the angle the show eventually provides, a piece of infrastructure for a manhunt. The smartest man in the universe spent his genius building a machine for finding one person, and the machine he built was everything the audience understood as the apparatus of his life. When Unmortrican arrives in the 7th season and delivers the confrontation the full run has been building toward, the show refuses the conventional shape of a revenge story's climax. There is no catharsis in the theatrical sense, no moment where the completion of the mission floods the pursuing character with release or closure, or the particular satisfaction that the revenge narrative promises will arrive when the debt is finally settled. Rick catches Rick Prime with the unwanted and complicated help of Evil Morty, who has his own reasons for wanting Rick Prime located and his own agenda that the confrontation serves. And the involvement of Evil Morty is itself part of what the episode is saying, because Rick cannot reach the conclusion of his own revenge story without the assistance of a being who spent the series pursuing an entirely different kind of escape. The two of them, the grief-organized Rick and the rage-organized Morty, arrive at Rick Prime together by paths that were never really parallel and for reasons that were never really the same. Rick Prime, when finally cornered, is the show's most honest statement about what the object of a revenge mission looks like from the inside of the Hunt versus the outside of it. From inside the Hunt, he was the organizing antagonist, the figure whose existence justified everything, the target that kept the purpose alive. From outside it, or rather from the position the episode forces Rick into when the confrontation is immediate and physical rather than abstract and tactical, Rick Prime is simply a man, and the show is careful not to make him more than that in the episode's final stretch. He is described as the better fighter when they meet directly. He is colder and more indifferent than Rick C-137, which is the show's way of making visible the distinction between a Rick organized around a loss and a Rick organized around nothing at all. And the distinction does not favor Rick C-137 in the combat sense, even though it does in every sense the show actually cares about. Rick Prime is what a Rick becomes when no one and nothing ever reached him enough to break him open, which makes him the show's most complete image of what the intelligence without the grief underneath it produces. He is more efficient and less human, and the show is clear that these two facts are connected. The aftermath is where the revenge paradox completes itself and delivers the show's most quietly devastating moment in the season. Rick stands at what should be the resolution of everything, the goal that organized decades is accomplished, and the show gives him nothing. He is despondent in a way that the word does not adequately cover, visibly emptied, without orientation, asking the question that the revenge narrative promises will never need to be asked because the completion of the mission is supposed to answer it before it can form. The question is what he does now. The mission is over. The structure is gone. The forward motion that the Hunt authorized on a daily basis has run into its own conclusion and stopped. And the stopping reveals what was underneath the motion the entire time, which was not strength or purpose or even anger, but the grief the motion was designed to ensure he never had to stop and face. This is the paradox at its most complete. A man who organized his entire existence around recovering something that could not be recovered through any action the organization authorized. Killing Rick Prime does not return Diane. It does not unerase her from the dimensions the Omega device reached. It does not restore the original timeline, or the original family, or the original version of the life the original afternoon destroyed. It does not even provide the feeling of debt settled that revenge narratives traditionally use as their payoff, because the debt that was accrued on the day Diane died was not the kind of debt that any action performed in the present can retroactively balance. The debt was grief, and grief does not accept payment. It accepts presence. Rick spent decades building an elaborate argument against having to be present with the grief, and the argument's conclusion left him in exactly the place the argument was designed to prevent, standing in the grief with nothing left to stand behind. The show has been gesturing toward this outcome since the second season. The Unity episode ended with him in the garage, and the show staged the garage scene as the grief coming back through the door that the revenge mission could not reach. The personal loss, distinct from the revenge architecture, in the specific way that a feeling you are running from is always distinct from the mission you are running toward. The hunt was organized around Diane's death, but it was aimed at Rick Prime. And the difference between what the hunt was about and what the hunt was aimed at is the full distance between grief and revenge. Grief requires the griever to remain in the presence of the loss. Revenge requires the griever to move toward the person responsible for it. The motion of revenge is, structurally, the motion of grief converted into pursuit. And the conversion is the lie at the center of every revenge narrative, including this one. It promises that the motion will eventually deliver you to the feeling in a form you can survive. What it delivers, when the motion finally stops, is the feeling exactly as it was when you started moving. Bird Person is the figure whose experience of Rick across the full span of their friendship maps the revenge paradox's deepest costs. He knew Rick before the hunt organized him, fought alongside him in the resistance years when Rick's intelligence was aimed outward at genuine causes rather than inward at a single target, and lost decades of a friendship to the version of Rick that the hunt produced. The sixth season's extended sequence inside Bird Person's damaged mind is the most emotionally direct thing the show does in that season, and it works partly because it allows Rick to encounter his own history from the inside of another person's memory, rather than from the inside of the mission that the history produced. He is forced in those sequences to see himself as Bird Person saw him, as someone who changed in a specific direction for a specific reason and took a long time to fully arrive at being the person the grief wanted to make him. The revenge paradox, from inside Bird Person's mind, looks like the story of a friendship that survived the transformation and paid a heavy price for surviving it. Evil Morty's role in Unmortrican is the show's most structurally elegant commentary on the revenge paradox's architecture. He facilitates the confrontation not because he shares Rick's grief or endorses Rick's purpose, but because Rick Prime's existence serves his own operational needs, and removing it serves them differently. He is using Rick's revenge mission the way Rick used Morty's brainwaves, as cover and resource for a purpose the other party does not fully understand. And the parallel is the show's way of saying that the revenge mission's relationship to its own stated purpose was never as simple as it presented itself. Rick hunted Rick Prime for Diane. Evil Morty helped Rick find Rick Prime for reasons adjacent to, but not identical with that. The clean story of grief-organized revenge arrives at its conclusion through a collaboration that is itself organized around something else entirely. And the contamination of the ending by the complexity of the means is the show refusing to deliver the revenge narrative it spent seasons building up to. The acceptance of the hug that follows the killing, Morty offering it and Rick allowing it in the quiet aftermath, is the paradox's resolution insofar as the paradox has one. The revenge is complete and the grief is still there, and the person standing next to him is the person the series has identified across its full run as the one most consistently capable of reaching him, and he does not convert the moment into something he can manage from a distance. He lets it be what it is, which is a person who loves him, holding him in the place where everything he built around the loss just ran out of structure. It is not healing, and the show does not present it as healing, because a hug in a room where Rick Prime just died is not the thing that addresses what Rick Prime's existence was protecting him from. It is simply the first moment after the structure collapsed where he did not immediately build a replacement, and the show treats that small failure to reconstruct as the most honest thing it has seen him do in 8 seasons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Revenge Paradox showed a mission that organized a lifetime and dissolved the moment it succeeded, leaving the grief it was built to avoid exactly where it always was. Next, Next, the ninth paradox examines the one limit no enemy in the multiverse ever successfully imposed on him, the limit he imposed on himself by engineering a life with no final stakes. Section 9. The immortality paradox. Death has rules. For most of the beings inside the world the show constructs, the rules run the same way they run in every world. The body fails at some point and the person inside it stops. The rules produce urgency. They produce the pressure that makes a choice feel like a choice rather than a deferral. The awareness that the window for doing a thing is not infinitely wide and that choosing not to act today is a choice with a shape and a cost. Every meaningful decision a person makes inside a finite life carries the weight of the finite life behind it. The knowledge that the time available is not renewable and that the person making the decision will not always be there to make it. Mortality is, among other things, the condition that makes meaning possible, the constraint that turns a moment into something that matters because the moment will not return. Rick Sanchez dismantled this constraint early and thoroughly, and then kept living inside its absence, which is the ninth paradox, and it is the one the show handles most quietly because the consequences of it are ambient rather than episodic. Operation Phoenix does not arrive in the story announced as a philosophical problem. It arrives as a plot mechanic, a technical system Rick built whose purpose is to ensure that his death in any dimension automatically uploads his consciousness to a waiting clone body. The fourth season premiere, Edge of Tomorty, is where the system's full operation becomes visible, when Rick dies in the episode's first act and the upload chain begins, bouncing him through dimension after dimension as each available clone runs into a hostile environment and expires, keeping him alive through a cascade of deaths that costs him nothing permanent. He treats the experience as inconvenient. He dies multiple times in the course of the episode, and the dying registers, from his perspective, as something closer to a frustrating commute than to an ending. The system's origin in the second season episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez frames it as an experiment he eventually declared a failure, because the young clone body he transferred into to hunt a vampire at his grandchildren's school began overriding his original personality, and the threat of losing himself inside a designed alternative self was enough to make him shut the program down and destroy the clone bodies he had stored. He did not shut it down because making himself functionally immortal was wrong. He shut it down because that specific implementation had a side effect he could not tolerate, which is the distinction the show is careful to preserve. His objection was technical rather than philosophical. He tried again, or rather, he kept the program running in other dimensions whose Ricks had solved the personality problem, and the fourth season premiere confirms that the solution existed and that he eventually had access to it. The failure he announced in the second season was a version failure, not an abandonment of the project. What this means across the full run of the series is that Rick has been operating without the constraint that organizes most lives for longer than the audience knows. The years of the galactic resistance, the years of building the Citadel, the years of the manhunt, the years of the borrowed family in the borrowed dimension. All of them were years lived by a person for whom death was a process with a recovery protocol rather than a termination. The urgency that mortality supplies to a finite life was not available to him as an organizing pressure, which means every choice he made about how to spend his time was a choice made without the natural deadline that makes choices feel weighted. He had unlimited time, and the show suggests, across everything it builds around him, that unlimited time is its own kind of trap. A person who can always do it tomorrow has no particular reason to do it today, and the person Rick most needed to become required exactly the pressure that immortality removed. Rick Prime's death in the seventh season is where the immortality paradox intersects most directly with the revenge arc the show had been building. Evil Morty's involvement in that episode included destroying Rick Prime's contingency backups, the hidden clone bodies and consciousness storage that would have allowed Rick Prime to survive his own killing the same way Rick C-137 survived his deaths throughout the series. This is the episode's most structurally precise moment because it makes the killing permanent in a way that killing Rick C-137 for most of the series would not have been. Rick Prime could be killed because Evil Morty removed his recovery protocol. Rick C-137 could not be killed in the same final sense because his protocol was still running. The confrontation between them was, in the technical sense, asymmetric from the start, and the asymmetry is the immortality paradox's contribution to the revenge story. The man hunting someone who hurt him could not be killed by the person he was hunting, which means the hunt was never a genuine contest with genuine stakes for him in the way hunts are supposed to be. He risked everything and risked nothing simultaneously, because everything meant his family's safety and nothing meant his own life, and those two things were always tracked separately. The surrender at Bird Person's wedding in the third season is the episode that most clearly marks the line between what immortality protects him from and what it cannot reach. When the Federation ambushes the celebration and the situation collapses into a firefight, Rick has every capability available to fight clear. The survivor tier that has carried him out of every other trap the show has placed him in is fully operational, and the Federation agents are not, individually or collectively, a match for what he can do when cornered and motivated. He surrenders anyway, exchanging his freedom for the safety of his family, and the exchange is the show's clearest statement that the person inside the immortality machine still has something to lose. His own death had become a manageable inconvenience. His family's deaths had not. The consciousness transfer and the clone bodies and Operation Phoenix protect only Rick Sanchez, and the things he cannot protect through technical systems are the things that still have the power to reach him. The garage scene in autoerotic assimilation is the immortality paradox's most painful single image, and the show stages it with the restraint the subject requires. He has just lost Unity, who left because being near him makes her worse, and the recognition that his presence is destructive enough to drive away a being capable of controlling entire planets carries a specific weight that the immortality system has no mechanism for addressing. He assembles a device. He prepares it to function in one direction and then the other. He passes out before it completes its preparation and wakes up in the morning at his workbench. The show does not editorialize. It does not resolve the moment into a lesson or a turning point. It simply lets the image stand. A man who built a system to make death optional reached for that option in the hours after the worst evening of his adult life, and the system that was supposed to protect him from death was not the system he was operating. He was not trying to escape a finite life. He was trying to escape an infinite one. This is the inversion that sits at the center of the paradox, and the show earns it through 8 seasons of evidence. The conventional fear is of a life too short to accomplish what matters. Rick's problem, the one the show builds carefully enough to be legible without being announced, is a life too long and too structurally protected to retain the pressure that makes accomplishing things feel necessary. He woke up in the 4th season premiere after dying multiple times and was irritated. He rebuilt himself after Federation imprisonment and Citadel collapse in a single afternoon and called it a productive day. He has faced the end of his own existence on dozens of occasions across the run, and returned from each one without the particular change that near death produces in beings for whom death is actually near. The experiences that reorient finite lives do not reorient his, because reorientation requires the awareness that the current trajectory is the only available one, and the current trajectory is never his only available one. There is always another clone. There is always another dimension. There is always another portal out. What the immortality removed, alongside the finality of death, is the companion pressure that mortality applies to relationships. A person with a finite life and the people they love moving toward the same finite end has reasons, supplied by the shared deadline, to repair what is broken before the repair becomes impossible. Rick has no shared deadline. He will outlive the version of his family he is currently with, and then locate another borrowed reality and continue, which is precisely the pattern the show established in the first season, when he portaled himself and Morty out of the dimension he ruined into the one whose Rick and Morty had just died. The immortality system makes the exit from any given reality a managed procedure rather than a tragedy, and the show asks what a person becomes who never has to face the irreversibility of losing a specific version of a specific life. The answer it builds over 8 seasons is Rick Sanchez, technically eternal, relationally provisional, present in every room, and fully committed to none of them. The contingency backups the show reveals Rick Prime maintained are the mirror that completes the portrait. Both versions of the man built the same system for the same reason, and the system served both of them in the same way across the full span of their stories. Neither could be killed by ordinary means. Neither had to face the pressure that mortality applies to choices. The difference between them is not the technical arrangement, but what they did inside the protection the arrangement provided, which is the show's final word on whether immortality is the problem or the use of it. Rick C-137, inside his protected existence, kept returning to a family. Rick Prime, inside his, remained alone and indifferent and aimed at nothing except the avoidance of any connection that might reach him. The immortality did not make either of them who they were. It simply removed the pressure that might have forced them to be otherwise, and left each of them with the version of themselves they would have chosen anyway, extended indefinitely and insulated from consequence. The paradox's resolution, to the extent it has one, is the same small moment the revenge paradox ends on. Rick accepts a hug in the quiet after killing Rick Prime, and the acceptance is not made possible by anything in the immortality architecture. It is made possible by nothing more than the person standing next to him and the absence, for one moment, of a replacement structure already under construction. He is not reborn, and not changed, and not suddenly finite. He is simply, briefly present, without the machinery running, and the show holds that moment as the closest thing to genuine aliveness the immortality paradox ever allows him. He cannot die, and he does not live, except in the seconds when the system is quiet, and the person beside him is real enough to pull him past the edge of the management and into the unmanaged thing the management was always designed to prevent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The immortality paradox showed a man who removed the one constraint that makes a life feel urgent, and discovered that a life without stakes is not freedom, but a longer version of the same stillness he has always been running from. Next, the final paradox gathers every thread the climb produced and asks the question 8 seasons of evidence was assembled to answer. What is the smartest mind ever depicted actually for? Section 10. The Genius Paradox. By the later seasons, after the show has established what Rick can do and demonstrated it across enough episodes that the demonstration no longer surprises anyone, a small and unspectacular thing happens that the camera holds on longer than the surrounding material would seem to require. Rick sits at the dinner table with his family. Nobody is in danger, no dimension is collapsing, there is no scheme running underneath the surface of the meal that the audience will discover in the third act. He sits at the table with the people he keeps returning to across 8 seasons of evidence that he will keep returning to them, and the show holds on the image the way it holds on the garage in the mornings, without comment, without score, without any signal that the image is more significant than it appears. A man who can restructure the accessible multiverse is sitting at a table eating food with his family. The show treats this as the hardest thing it has ever shown him do. That is the 10th paradox, and the show builds toward it through everything else it builds. The genius of Rick Sanchez is total and verified, and the series never manufactures a moment of false humility where the genius is revealed to be less than advertised. He can do what the show says he can do, and what the show says he can do is more than any other character in any comparable fiction has been credibly shown doing. The portal gun works. The microverse runs. The Federation fell in an afternoon. Operation Phoenix keeps him alive through his own deaths. The central finite curve enclosed infinity. These are not exaggerations the show eventually walks back, or limitations it eventually reveals behind the performance. The intelligence is genuine, operating at a level the word genius was never built to describe, requiring the show to keep escalating the scale of what it asks the intelligence to do just to keep the demonstration proportionate to the claim. And yet, the dinner table is hard. The couch is hard. Standing in a room where nothing is happening and nobody needs saving, and the only available action is to be present with the specific people in the specific room without a task to complete or a threat to manage or a scheme to run underneath the surface of the interaction, is the operation that defeats him more consistently than any enemy the multiverse has ever produced. Zeep Zanflorp found a way to resist him. Rick Prime evaded him for decades. Evil Morty outplanned him across the full span of the series. None of them defeated him the way an ordinary evening at home defeats him, the way a quiet room without an exit already selected defeats him, the way another person simply wanting to be near him without wanting anything else from him defeats him. The show spent 8 seasons finding the one thing that reliably beats the smartest mind ever depicted, and the answer is presence. The unglamorous, low-stakes, completely ordinary human act of remaining in a room because the people in the room are the reason to be there. The Genius Paradox builds on a specific quality of Rick's intelligence that the show makes visible early and never stops demonstrating. The intelligence requires a problem. It is, in the technical sense, a problem-solving instrument, the most powerful one available to any being in the story. And a problem-solving instrument needs problems, the way an engine needs something to push against. When Rick is threatened, the instrument fires at full capacity and produces the solutions the show has spent 8 seasons cataloging. When Rick is bored, the instrument manufactures problems to solve, which is where most of the adventures originate, where the inventions that cause catastrophes begin, where the schemes that eventually damage the people he loves are conceived. The instrument does not have a setting for simply being present, for occupying a space without a task attached to the occupation, for being in a room because being in a room is enough. That setting would require the instrument to go quiet, and the instrument going quiet is the condition the Genius genius paradox reveals as the one condition Rick's intelligence cannot produce from within itself. Dr. Wong named the mechanism in Pickle Rick, and named it clinically enough to survive any defense he could build against it. She did not say he was broken, or damaged, or irredeemably committed to the patterns she was describing. She said the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness, and the specific form of the justification she identified was the genius deployed against the work of repair, used not to fix what is broken, but to produce sophisticated arguments for why the broken thing is actually something else, something that does not require the repair she was recommending. The genius paradox is that the instrument sophisticated enough to build and demolish civilizations is routinely turned against the single task that would most benefit from it, which is the honest examination of the man who built the civilizations and why he built them and what the building was protecting him from. He can think about anything except the thing that thinking would most illuminate, because illumination requires a stillness the thinking was built to prevent. His relationship with Bird Person is the clearest evidence that the genius paradox has an exception, and exceptions are where paradoxes reveal their actual shape. Bird Person knew Rick before the genius was fully weaponized in the direction the show documents, before the portal gun existed and the Citadel was founded, and the central finite curve turned infinity into a managed property. The friendship from those years carries a quality the rest of Rick's relationships do not, which is the quality of having been formed before Rick understood how to use his mind as a wall. Bird Person got in before the wall was finished, and the show treats that historical fact as the reason the friendship holds across everything the intervening decades produced. When Rick goes into Bird Person's damaged mind in the 6th season to try to pull his oldest friend back from the edge, he performs emotional labor more demanding and more sustained than anything the survival tier or the manipulation tier or the strategic tier requires from him. He stays in an uncomfortable place for a reason that has nothing to do with a mission and everything to do with the specific person he cannot afford to lose. And the staying is not managed and not converted into anything more defensible than what it is. He is there because Bird Person matters to him, and that is the whole of the reason. And the genius paradox is briefly suspended in those sequences because the situation requires him to operate on the frequency the genius cannot access. The exception proves the rule in the way exceptions actually prove rules, not by disproving them, but by revealing the conditions under which the rule fails to apply. The genius paradox suspends for Bird Person because Bird Person predates the conditions that produced it. The paradox holds for the rest of the relationships because those relationships were formed after Rick understood, consciously or not, how to ensure that the instrument would not have to go quiet in them. He manages Morty. He manages Beth. He manages the household climate and the emotional temperature of every room he occupies. Management is the genius running at reduced capacity on a continuous low hum, ensuring that no interaction ever reaches the threshold at which the instrument would have to stop and the person would have to simply be there. The efficiency of the management is the genius paradox's most insidious expression because it is invisible as management from inside the household. It reads as personality. It reads as who he is. The people around him have never seen the instrument fully quiet, which means they have never seen the version of him that would be present if it went quiet. And the genius paradox is partly the tragedy of people who love someone they have never been allowed to fully meet. Summer comes closest to seeing it, and the show marks this through the specific quality of his treatment of her, which is different enough from how he treats the rest of the household to constitute its own kind of statement. He manages her less. He pulls fewer strings in her direction, deploys fewer of the social instruments the manipulation tier makes available to him, allows her reactions to land without immediately routing them into a predetermined outcome. The show frames this as a grudging recognition that she is sharp enough to see some of the machinery, which is accurate, but there is another reading the show also supports, that he respects the clarity she brings to a room enough to let the room be clear when she is in it, which is the closest the genius paradox comes to a voluntary suspension during a relationship that did not exist before the wall was built. He cannot fully let the instrument go quiet for her the way it goes quiet for Bird Person, but he turns down the volume, and the difference is audible if you have been listening to everything else at full. The show makes one choice across its full run that the genius paradox explains and nothing else adequately does, which is the choice to keep the garage. He has access to every reality inside a curated infinity, and he keeps the garage. He has the portal gun, and the workbench, and the stool, and the flask, and the people upstairs, and the people upstairs are not in the garage with him, but they are above him, them, and he is below them. And the spatial arrangement is the arrangement he keeps returning to after every departure. The garage is where the instrument runs at full capacity, where the hands have a task and the mind has a problem, and the creative velocity the genius requires can find legitimate application in the building of something that did not exist before he sat down. But the garage is also beneath the house, beneath the family, positioned by the architecture of the borrowed reality as the ground floor of the place they all share. And the show never makes this explicit, and never needs to, because the image carries the argument. He is under the same roof. He keeps choosing to be under the same roof. The genius paradox cannot explain this choice, and the genius cannot make it. Only the man underneath the genius, the one who shows up in the gaps between the instrument's assignments, keeps making this particular choice, again and again, across the full run of the series. Rick's catchphrase is the genius paradox in its most compressed form, and the show delivered this in the 11th episode of the first season and trusted the audience to carry it the rest of the way. A being who cannot solve the simple human problem of saying plainly that he is in pain reached for the most elaborate possible alternative, a nonsense sound in a foreign language that means exactly the thing he cannot say, delivered in a room full of people who do not speak the language, aimed at the one person present who does. The genius solution to the impossibility of plain speech is a covert channel embedded in performance, sophisticated enough to function as genuine concealment and transparent enough to someone who knows him to be the exact disclosure it appears to be hiding. It is, technically, brilliant. It is also the saddest possible way to ask for help. And the sadness and the brilliance are the same thing, which is the genius paradox in its smallest and most complete expression. He cannot simply say it. He can build an entire linguistic structure to say it in without being heard by anyone not already fluent in what he is. And the fluency required to hear it is the fluency of having been near him long enough to understand that the performance is never the whole of him. What the show builds across all 10 paradoxes and delivers here in the 10th is not a verdict on Rick Sanchez, but a portrait drawn with enough care and enough patience that the portrait is honest about both halves of what it depicts. The genius is real. The paradox is real. The intelligence that can restructure the multiverse and the inability to sit quietly in a room without converting the quiet into a problem to solve are not contradictions that cancel each other out. They are the same trait at different temperatures, the same instrument aimed at the scale that matches the need. And the need the genius was built to serve was never the exploration of the infinite, but the management of the specific grief that the infinite was constructed to contain. And maybe that is enough. 10 paradoxes, 8 seasons, one man who keeps failing to be as far away as he works so hard to be. He goes back to the garage. He sits at the table. The people upstairs stay upstairs, and he stays below them. And none of it resolves the way a story is supposed to resolve, because real people do not resolve. They just keep going. Rick keeps going. Back to the garage, back to the table, back to the same few people in the same borrowed house, which is when everything else is quiet. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.